A man can own the world and still be a prisoner in his own home. For Mr. Kong, this was not a philosophy, but a reality etched into the silent, polished surfaces of his sprawling mansion. The silence was his true fortune, a suffocating inheritance far heavier than the empires he commanded with a single, quiet phone call. From his office, a fortress of smoked glass and dark mahogany, he watched the world on a dozen screens. He managed shipping lanes, political favors, and the brutal arithmetic of power, yet the one domain he could not conquer was the small, soundless world of his own son. His power ended at the door to the playroom, where a 10-year-old boy named Minjun lived in a kingdom without sound, a kingdom whose walls had been built the day his mother died. Mr. Kang's world was one of suspicion, a necessary tool of his trade that had long ago curdled into the very lens through which he saw everything. He trusted no one, because trust was a currency for the weak, a vulnerability he could not afford. This suspicion now fell upon the newest member of his household staff, a young woman named Chloe. She was an anomaly, an American woman of color in a household of meticulously vetted Korean staff. Her resume was flawless, her references impeccable, but in Mr. Kang's world, perfection was merely a mask for a hidden agenda. So he watched her. On a dedicated monitor on his expansive desk, he tracked her movements through the sterile hallways of his home. He saw her desk shelves that were already clean, polished silver that already gleamed. She was efficient, quiet, and invisible, just as she was meant to be. But his gaze always sharpened when her duties took her near Minjun's wing of the house. He leaned closer to the screen, his jaw tight, waiting for the inevitable mistake, the moment of deceit that would confirm his worldview. He expected her to be like the others, to treat the boy like a fragile piece of glass, to offer a pitying glance and then hurry away from the uncomfortable silence. What he saw instead, on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, made the air in his lungs freeze. She did not hurry away.
She walked right in.
The day his world shattered had been drenched in sunlight, a cruel mockery of the darkness that was about to fall. His wife, Sujin, had been life itself. Her laughter was the melody that filled the cavernous rooms of the mansion, her presence the warmth that made it a home. She smelled of gardenias and honey, and she believed, with a fierce and gentle heart, that there was goodness in everyone, even in a man like him. She was his anchor, the one person whose belief in him made him want to be the man she saw. They had been driving back from a weekend at their countryside villa, Minjun, then only 5, asleep in the back, his small hand clutching a toy car. Sujin was humming a lullaby, her head resting against the passenger window, her eyes closed in contentment. The memory was a series of fractured, blinding flashes, the squeal of tires, the impossible crunch of metal, the world turning upside down in a storm of glass and screaming. He remembered waking up to the smell of gasoline and the terrifying silence from the passenger seat. He remembered turning to look at Minjun, whose eyes were wide open, staring, not at the wreckage, but at his mother's still form. The boy did not cry. He did not make a sound. From that moment on, the silence became his companion. The doctors called it selective mutism, post-traumatic deafness. They used clinical, sterile terms to describe the horror that had locked itself inside his son. They said the trauma was so profound that his brain had simply shut down the pathways for sound and speech, a desperate act of self-preservation. There were no physical injuries to his ears or vocal cords. The damage was deeper, in a place no surgeon's knife could reach. Mr. Kong had flown in specialists from every corner of the globe. He had offered them fortunes, threatening them with his immense power, begging them with the broken heart of a father. They all left with the same solemn shake of the head. The boy had chosen silence, they said, and only he could choose to leave it. Mr. Kong saw it as a failure, the ultimate testament to his own impotence. He could move mountains of money and men, but he could not reach across a silent room to find his own son. The mansion became a tomb, and Minjun, its silent ghost. Chloe arrived on a Monday, dressed in the simple, dark blue uniform provided for the staff. She stood before Mr. Kong in his office, her hands clasped respectfully, her gaze direct but not challenging. She was tall and graceful, with kind eyes that seemed entirely out of place in the cold, calculated environment of his home. He had approved her hiring from a file, a collection of papers that told him nothing of the spirit within the person. He had needed a replacement for an older maid who had retired, and her agency came with the highest recommendations for discretion and thoroughness. He dismissed her with a curt nod, his attention already back on his business ledgers. To him, she was a function, a pair of hands to maintain the perfect, lifeless order of his house. He gave his head of security, a grim-faced man named Mr. Choi, a simple instruction. Watch her. Report everything. For the first week, the reports were mundane. She was punctual, meticulous, and kept to herself. She followed her cleaning schedules with an unnerving precision. She ate her meals alone in the staff kitchen and retired to her room promptly at the end of her shift. She was a ghost in the machine, so perfect that it grated on Mr. Kang's nerves. He found himself watching her on the cameras more and more, not just for security, but out of a gnawing, irritated curiosity. He watched her arrange flowers in the grand foyer, her touch gentle, as if she were coaxing the blooms to life. He saw her pause by a window to watch a bird build its nest in a cherry tree, a small, genuine smile gracing her lips for a moment before she remembered her duties and moved on. These small acts of quiet humanity were like cracks in the sterile facade of his life, and they unsettled him. He told himself it was a performance, a carefully constructed act to win trust before the inevitable betrayal. He waited for her to rifle through a drawer, to make a discreet phone call, to show any sign of the duplicity he knew was inherent in people. But she did nothing. She simply worked, her presence a quiet, steady rhythm in the silent house, a rhythm that was slowly starting to feel less like a threat and more like a whisper of something he had long forgotten. The first time she entered Minjun's playroom, Mr. Kang's entire body tensed. He was in his office, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the floor. He had been reviewing shipping manifests, but his eyes kept flicking to the monitors showing the playroom. It was a bright, cheerful room filled with every toy a child could desire, yet it was always as quiet as a museum exhibit. Minjun sat in the center of the floor, listlessly stacking a set of wooden blocks, his movements slow and mechanical. He never built anything imaginative. He just stacked them until they fell, then began again. The door opened, and Chloe entered with a small basket of folded laundry. The previous maids would have placed the basket on the dresser and fled, their discomfort palpable even through the grainy camera feed. Chloe did not. She placed the laundry away, then paused, her back to the camera. Mr. Kong held his breath. He saw her turn and look at Minjun. The boy, as always, did not acknowledge her. He continued his cycle of stacking and falling, lost in his silent world. Chloe slowly walked over and sat on the floor, a respectful distance away.
She didn't speak.
She didn't try to touch him. She simply sat there, sharing his silence. For a full 10 minutes, she just sat, her presence calm and unassuming. Then, she reached out and picked up a single red block from a scattered pile. She didn't add it to his tower. She just held it in her palm, her fingers tracing its smooth edges.
Minun's second falset.
His eyes, for a fraction of a second, darted towards the red block in her hand before returning to his tower. It was a flicker of awareness so small, so insignificant, that anyone else would have missed it. But Mr. Kong, whose world had shrunk to this single screen, saw it. He leaned forward, his face inches from the monitor, his heart hammering against his ribs. It was nothing, he told himself. A coincidence, a trick of the light. But he could not shake the image of that tiny, momentary connection in a world that had been devoid of any for 5 long years. He rewound the footage, his hand trembling slightly, and watched it again. And again. The boy had seen her. In that vast, empty silence, for one brief second, his son had seen her. This single, quiet moment became a ritual. Every afternoon, after her primary duties were completed, Chloe would go to Minjun's room. Mr. Kong found himself living for these moments, his multi-billion-dollar empire fading into the background. The security feed was his sacred text, the playroom his temple. He watched as Chloe's methods evolved with a patience that was both baffling and captivating. She never pushed, never demanded. She offered. One day, she brought a piece of paper and a crayon. She sat on the floor and began to draw a simple, smiling sun. She left the drawing and the crayon near Minjun, who ignored it completely. The next day, she drew a tree. The day after, a house. The drawings accumulated in a small pile, a silent testament to her persistence. Then she began to use her hands. Mr. Kong watched, mystified, as she made graceful, deliberate motions in the air. He didn't understand what she was doing at first, but then a memory surfaced of a consultant he'd hired years ago, a specialist who had tried to teach Minjun sign language. The boy had been utterly unresponsive, his gaze vacant. But now, as Chloe formed the signs, Minjun's eyes would occasionally follow the movement of her fingers. She would point to a ball and then shape her hands into a sphere. She would touch a book and then press her palms together, opening them like a cover. She was teaching him a language he might be able to understand. And then came the singing. It was the most bewildering part of her ritual. He knew the room was soundproofed from his office, but he could see her mouth forming words, her expression soft and full of melody. She sang to a boy who could not hear, her voice a silent offering into the void. Mr. Kong felt a knot of anger and confusion tighten in his chest. Was this mockery? A cruel performance? But her face held no deceit. It was filled with a sincerity so profound it felt like an accusation against his own cynicism. One evening, driven by an impulse he couldn't explain, he typed American Sign Language into his computer. He watched videos, his powerful mind that dissected complex financial contracts now struggling to learn the simple signs for hello, friend, and hope. He was an observer, a spy in his own home, learning the secret language that was unfolding in silence between a maid and his lost son. The change in Minjun was not a sudden storm, but the slow, almost imperceptible melting of a frozen river. Mr. Kong, the vigilant watchman, was the first to notice. It began with the boy's eyes. They were no longer fixed on the meaningless task at hand. They would follow Chloe as she moved around the room, a sliver of curiosity cutting through the fog of his apathy. One afternoon, Chloe was signing the alphabet, her hands dancing in the air. She got to the letter C, forming a gentle curve with her hand. Minjun, who was supposed to be stacking his blocks, had stopped, his own small hand twitching in his lap. He slowly, clumsily, tried to mimic the shape. It was a broken, uncertain gesture, but it was a response. It was a message sent back from the silent island where his son had been marooned. Mr. Kong shot up from his chair, his breath caught in his throat. He stumbled towards the monitor, his face pressed against the cool glass, as if he could will himself through it into that room. He rewound the footage. He watched the tiny hand curl into a hesitant C, over and over again. This was not a fluke. This was not a trick of the light. This was communication. A flicker of hope, an emotion he had long considered a dangerous indulgence, ignited within him. It was terrifying. Hope meant there was something to lose. For 5 years, he had lived in the cold comfort of rock bottom. There was no further to fall. But this tiny, flickering gesture from his son threatened to pull him back into the world of feeling, a world of potential pain and devastating disappointment. His suspicion of Chloe began to morph into something far more complex. The woman was not a threat to his fortune or his security. She was a threat to his grief. She was chipping away at the fortress of despair he had built around his heart, and he didn't know if he was ready for what lay inside. He began to watch her not with the eyes of a mafia boss looking for betrayal, but with the desperate, pleading eyes of a father searching for a miracle. The question was no longer what she wanted from him, but what she was so effortlessly giving to his son. Mr. Kang's life began to revolve entirely around the silent drama playing out on his laptop screen. Billion-dollar deals were put on hold, his lieutenants were met with uncharacteristic silence, and the intricate web of his empire was left to manage itself. His universe had shrunk to the dimensions of a child's playroom. He started to recognize the patterns in Chloe's lessons. She was building a world for Minjun, one sign at a time. She taught him the signs for colors, for animals, for feelings. He watched as Minjun, with growing confidence, signed back. Blue, dog, happy. The signs were still clumsy, but they were clear. One day, Chloe brought a small, framed photograph into the room. Mr. Kang's blood ran cold when he recognized it. It was a picture of Sujin, his late wife, smiling her radiant smile. It was a picture he kept on his own desk, a painful, sacred relic. He felt a surge of rage. How dare she? How dare she bring that memory, that pain, into this fragile space? He was about to storm out of his office to put an end to this intrusion, but he stopped, his hand on the doorknob. On the screen, Chloe was showing the picture to Minjun. She gently tapped the image, then brought her thumb to her chin and opened her hand in a gentle arc. Mr. Kong, the secret student of sign language, recognized the sign instantly. Mother, she was giving him back his mother. Minjun stared at the photograph, his eyes wide. He reached out a trembling finger and touched the glass over his mother's face. Then, he looked at his own hand and slowly, deliberately, brought his thumb to his chin and made the same gentle, arcing motion. Mother, Mr. Kong sank back into his chair, the rage dissolving into a wave of grief so powerful it buckled him. He had hidden away all of Sujin's pictures, thinking he was protecting the boy from the pain of her absence. He had tried to erase the memory, believing it was the source of the trauma. But this gentle woman, this stranger, understood something he did not. You don't heal a wound by pretending it isn't there. You heal it by letting in the light. He watched, tears blurring the screen, as his son signed the word mother, again and again, a silent prayer to a memory he had not been allowed to touch. The atmosphere in the mansion, once heavy and stagnant, had begun to stir. The oppressive silence was still there, but it no longer felt like a permanent condition. It felt like the quiet before a dawn. Mr. Kong found himself walking the halls of his own home, not as its master, but as a hopeful pilgrim. He would pause outside the playroom, listening to the nothingness, yet imagining the silent conversation happening within. He was too proud, too afraid to enter. The monitor was his shield, allowing him to witness the miracle without having to expose his own raw, vulnerable heart. One afternoon, he watched Chloe bring something new into the room. It was a small, wooden music box, intricately carved with birds and flowers.
His heart sank.
It was another cruel reminder of all his son had lost. The world of music was locked away from him forever.
But Chloe didn't seem to see it that way.
She sat on the floor in front of Minjun and wound the small key. She opened the lid, and a tiny ballerina began to twirl. Mr. Kong knew the melody well. It was a simple French lullaby that Sujin used to hum. Chloe began to sing along, her voice a silent movie on the screen. Then she did something extraordinary. She took Minjun's small hand and gently placed it on the side of the wooden box. She gestured for him to be still, to feel. Mr. Kong watched his son's face. At first, there was nothing. Then, a subtle shift. Minjun's eyebrows furrowed in concentration. His eyes widened slightly. He couldn't hear the music, but he could feel it. He could feel the vibrations of the delicate melody traveling through the wood, up his arm, and into his soul. A sound escaped Minjun's lips. It was not a word. It was a small, guttural noise, a rasp of vocal cords that had been dormant for 5 years. It was the sound of a rusty gate being forced open. On the screen, Chloe's singing stopped. Her eyes filled with tears as she looked at the boy, her expression one of pure, unadulterated joy. In his office, Mr. Kong leaped from his chair, knocking it over with a loud crash. He stared at the screen, his ears straining as if he could hear that tiny, momentous sound through the camera's microphone. He couldn't, but he had seen it. He had seen the beginning of the end of the silence. The climax did not arrive with a thunderclap, but with the gentle rustle of leaves on a sunny afternoon. Mr. Kong was in his usual spot, a sentinel at the screen, his entire being focused on the live feed from the garden. Chloe and Minjun were sitting on a bench near Sujin's rose bushes, the one part of the garden he had insisted the groundskeepers maintain to perfection. The sunlight filtered through the leaves, dappling them in gold. Chloe was in her element, her hands painting stories in the air. She plucked a deep red rose from a bush, careful to avoid the thorns. She held it out for Minjun to see. Then she brought her fingers to her nose and spread them outward, the sign for flower. Minjun copied her perfectly. She then touched her heart and moved her hand across her chest. Pretty, he copied that, too, a small smile finally gracing his lips. She looked at him, her expression so full of love it was almost painful for Mr. Kong to watch. She crossed her arms over her chest. I love you. Minjun watched her, his gaze unwavering. Then she pointed towards the grand house, towards the window of the office where she must have known, or perhaps just felt, that a father was watching. She tapped her chest, then pointed at the window. Your father. Then she made the sign for love again, directing it from the house to the boy. "Your father loves you." A profound change came over Minjun. It was as if that final piece of a puzzle had clicked into place, illuminating his entire world. The signs, the vibrations, the silent songs, the gentle patience, it had all been leading to this one truth. He was loved. He was not abandoned. He looked at Chloe, and then his gaze shifted, moving past her, locking onto the distant window of his father's office. It was an impossible connection, a look that transcended distance and glass. His mouth, a feature that had been slack and silent for half a decade, trembled. It opened. Mr. Kong, watching on the screen, stopped breathing. He saw the shape of the word before he could have possibly heard it. It was a Korean word, a word of pure, primal connection. A faint, fragile sound, like the first crack in a sheet of ice, traveled across the lawn. Then it came again, clearer, stronger, a sound that shattered 5 years of silence in a single instant. "Appa, father." Mr. Kong didn't remember getting up. He didn't remember the chair flying backward or the papers scattering from his desk. He was just running, his powerful legs eating up the distance through the cold, empty hallways, his heart exploding in his chest. He was running towards the sound. He was running towards his son. He burst through the French doors into the garden, his chest heaving, his polished shoes skidding on the stone patio. The world seemed to slow down. He saw his son, Minjun, standing now, his small body trembling, tears streaming down his face, but his eyes shining with a light Mr. Kong thought had been extinguished forever. He saw Chloe a few feet away, her hands pressed to her mouth, her own tears flowing freely, stepping back to give them space, her role as the catalyst complete. And he heard it again, with his own ears, not through a speaker or a dream, but real and alive in the sunlit air. Appa, the word was a key, unlocking a prison of grief Mr. Kong hadn't even realized he was trapped in. He stumbled forward and fell to his knees before his son, a man of immense power brought low by a single, perfect sound. He wrapped his arms around Minjun, pulling the boy into an embrace so tight he was afraid he might break him, yet so desperate he could never let go. He felt Minjun's small arms wrap around his neck, clinging to him. For the first time in 5 years, he was holding his son, not just the shell of him. He sobbed, great, heaving sounds of a dam breaking, washing away years of cold, silent despair. Laughter mixed with the tears, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy that echoed the laughter he had lost. Later, after the tears had subsided and the newness of sound had settled into a comfortable rhythm of whispered words and happy discoveries, Mr. Kong approached Chloe. He found her standing quietly by the rose bushes, ready to disappear back into the background. He stood before her, the great Mr. Kong, humbled. He tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He pulled out his checkbook, a clumsy, inadequate gesture. "Anything," he choked out. "Name a price. A house, a car, anything you want. It's yours." Chloe looked at him, her kind eyes holding no judgment, only a deep, soulful understanding. She gently shook her head, a small smile on her lips. "Sir, some things don't have a price," she said, her voice as soft as her actions had been. "Love is not a transaction. I just saw a child who needed to be reminded he was loved." Faith did the rest in that moment. Mr. Kong understood. He had spent his life accumulating wealth and power, believing they were the ultimate tools to shape the world. But he had been wrong. The greatest force on earth was not in a bank vault or at the end of a gun. It was in the patient, persistent, and unconditional love of a good heart. The silence never returned to the mansion. It was replaced by the sound of a boy's laughter, the endless chatter of questions about a world he was hearing for the first time, and the quiet, steady melody of a home reborn. Mr. Kong learned that true wealth isn't what you own or what you can buy, but the light you let into the dark and silent corners of the world, and the love you are brave enough to receive.